So with this talk here, it's kind of a play on words here that we'll never have enough water until it rains. And so as we started looking at, so I got to the University of Georgia is about 3.5 to 4 years ago from one state over in Florida. And when I first got there, about the first 6 months or so, I was handed this huge amount of survey data, and then we were looking at Georgia attitudes, and if you guys have watched the news in 2007, 2008, can we dim the lights a little bit? We were seeing scenes like this in Georgia, that just very severe drought, historic drought. As we're kind of going through, and what we noticed, or well, I guess what I noticed, I was coming from Florida, and there were kind of progressive things going on in Georgia. And from Florida, it's like the same thing as Oklahoma and Texas. I guess your next door neighbors, you always think the worst of them. And then so like the idea that folks in Georgia could be more progressive about water than Florida just was odd to me. And so then we really started suspecting that maybe drought had something to do with it. And that just kind of led through this whole kind of chain of logic. And so as Mike was talking about, there's this USDA National Water Quality Survey. It started in about 2001, and there's a whole huge paper that you can read about this that kind of goes in the history of this water survey. So it started off with the ARERA from 1998. It started. It started up in the Northwest. There were these surveys. They started, and over time, there was so much success that was up in the Northwest with these surveys that this just got expanded to every U.S. region. And so over about a 10-year period, we've had these surveys go out in about 41 states, some other territories, and about 10,900 respondents. And so this huge data set that we have about attitudes of water. And so I was first introduced to this. I've got this here, it's being passed around, that I was handed this from Georgia. And then we analyzed these questions, and so the goals of this survey were to essentially look at what are the public attitudes, what are priorities about water resources, and then to also see how these change over time. And then the other one was to actually look at extension. So we have extension programs all around the United States, and to see that, really to use evidence, to actually use, some real objective data to see how these things are actually working. And just kind of going through the history of extension, that the way, 15, 20 years ago, that it was, you'd have a water program, and it was mostly just kind of anecdotal, that it would be kind of talking with farmers and just kind of experience-based, and that can be very useful, but the idea was that we really need to be able to measure these things and really have some real objective data with surveys. There's going to be a lot of money being spent on this. We want to know that we're being effective. And then the third objective was that as we learn about what the public feels, what they know about water resources, that this can also help with extension to say, okay, how do we kind of take our programming and how do we change our programming based upon what are the needs that are out there with the public, and even with, say with some opinions, that if we can look at the survey and say, okay, well, the public's really getting this wrong. And so then really we might need to prioritize into those areas. So this started off with the Northwest, and it was a really complicated process. I was actually trying to summarize this, and there was a 10-step process that they went through. And so what it started off with was scoping, to just say, okay, what are the issues in terms of from USDA, just what are the priorities in terms of the water program, and then lots of the steps, and I just put this all in just one point here, a very complicated review process. It would go out to USDA, they'd get feedback from extension agents, from water quality coordinators, went out to EPA, went out to academics, went out to social scientists. Really this iterative, seems like a pretty painful process. I don't know if you're involved with it early on, Mike, but reading through it really seemed very complicated. And then actually went out, they actually would give it to folks and say, okay, now we want you to take the survey. They'd get feedback from that, and then they would change it. And then so once they got it right for the first set of surveys up in the Northwest, then they started taking it region by region, and they would get together with the water quality coordinators like Mike and change some of the questions to say what are the regional issues that are of importance within, say, the Southeast region, up in the Great Lakes region, up in the Northeast region. Then knowing that each region is going to have some issues that are going to be ones that are just going to be for that region, and about 50% of the questions would be region specific, and then there'd be 50% that were fairly common. One thing of actually working with this data set, it ended up being a pretty messy data set. So there's a lot of questions that are just for one, the other, and so just in terms of the surveys, and one of the things it was who's taken any methods in here with surveys? Anyone actually know about the Dillman method? So they actually use a 4-stage process with mail. So the first was, of course, they just would mail out the survey that explain what was going on with the survey. There would be some kind of cover note from extension from the state university. So for the survey, say for the state of Oklahoma, there'd be a letter from Mike saying, here's what we're doing with this survey, here's why we want you to take it. And so we'd go out and say, please take this. And about 2 weeks later, a reminder postcard saying, please send back your survey. And then after about 20 days, if it wasn't sent back, then they would send another survey. So really, just really bothering people to take this thing. And then after again, then there'd be another one more postcard. And so why is this all important? That if you know anything about surveys, this kind of response rate here, 46.3%, is actually pretty remarkable. I've been talking with survey people. Actually, at first, like when I was showing this to some survey folks, they were like, are you really sure that it's that high? We'd be happy with 10%, oftentimes 15%. So really effective, and it ranged from some states. Texas, I think, was the lowest at 33% because those Texans, I guess they're really recalcitrant. And then some states were, 50% or more. And so a very high response rate, which is good. And so now with all that kind of background, I'm just going to show some results here from what we found in Georgia. 1,100 of them were mailed, about 520 were returned. So again, very, very good response rate here, 47% within Georgia. And so just to show some results here from Georgia, that water quality, and this was pretty common throughout the states, that really looking at groundwater, that seemed to be the one almost in all the states that was most commonly to think, okay, we think groundwater is good or excellent, not so sure about surface water. And then with ocean water, that was always the one that seemed to be the worst. And so we just kind of see this sort of trend. And also with the groundwater, we'd often see very high, we don't know. We can't see it, so we don't really have an opinion. And so this here, I know there's a lot to look at, but one thing that really jumps out, if you kind of look at this, anything that had clean in it, this is asking what's the most important thing in terms of these water issues. And so, so having your drinking water be clean, who's going to say no to that? There is about, 4 or 5% of people that didn't think that was important, but and so we see clean and we see water, and I'm going to show up here what's kind of interesting in terms of Georgia, in terms of policy. We got this back, and all these things, interstate transfers and kind of transfers amongst river basins and sale of rights was not all that important compared to other things. And we found this surprising. I just wanted to show you some news stories at the time that we were getting back these results, that in terms of water policy, that was the big stuff at the time in Georgia, that if anyone knows about Atlanta, up in the metro area, the whole idea of interbasin transfers, everybody just is crazy about that. That like, no, we don't want to take it from the Chattahoochee River and put it into some other basin because it's going to be robbing from one or the other. All over Georgia, we also, pretty much in Georgia, we want to invade north. We want to go up to Tennessee. We want to steal their water from the Tennessee River. There's a whole interesting history there where in Tennessee, they actually passed laws saying we will ban any sale of this water to Georgia. So we like to fight about water in the South as well. And so this is all in the news. I mean, very, very much out there, but in terms of the public, it wasn't really something that was up at the top of the list. But then we said, okay, actions that we've taken to actually conserve water or to actually help with water quality, that this was a pretty large result down here. Changed how often that you water your yard. 67% of respondents said that they've done that. And also things like low flow faucets, toilets with fixtures. This was also pretty high here, 41%. Of these others, not so much. And this is where we get in the drought. And so why are we talking about drought here? So you guys know about drought here in Oklahoma. Here you have droughts occasionally. But back in the year 2007, there was this historic drought within the state of Georgia. The worst, some people would say it was the worst drought that they've ever had up in this part of the state. And so up in Atlanta, there were all sorts of drought committee meetings, level 4 restrictions on watering for these areas that were in this extremely severe drought. And so what does it mean, a level 4 water restriction? Basically, for any outdoor landscaping, you can hand water it for about 25 minutes, 3 times per week, but you're not allowed to turn on any kind of irrigation system. It's really, really restrictive in terms of what you could do there. And then even there are some exceptions for like newly installed landscapes, but for those you have to get a permit. You have to, like if you install a landscape, you have to go through this whole process of getting a permit, which is hard. It's a little bit, and so that can really kind of dissuade you from doing that. And so with these, that there was actually a pretty high percentage of water that was saved. If we look over here on the right, we look at all these different areas up in the metro area of Atlanta, 9%, 16% in Cobb County, 13.7% in Gwinnett. So pretty big amounts within about a month of these things going in. And so, so this is pointed to saying, look, we're making lots of progress. We're actually saving some water. And these things stayed in place until for about 2 years. In June of 2009 is when they finally started to lift these level 4 restrictions. And other things that came about because of this. But conservation pricing, not as much in the news. It's a little bit dry. But for almost all of the cities and towns and counties within this region, they actually do have a tiered. It's a very complex. I was going to try to actually summarize these, but there's, I don't know, like 25 cities and about 10 counties in this area, and each one of them has a slightly different way of doing their conservation pricing. But they're really only hitting the residential users in all of them when it comes to commercial users. Some counties do, some don't, and so that was an argument. Now, because it's been raining, there hasn't been as much argument about that here in the past year. And also, there's been a lot of local ordinances to say we want to promote you going in and trying to retrofit for fixtures and low flow toilets. This is one county that was doing that locally. You can actually get rebates from the state or from the Metro North Georgia Water Planning District for low flow toilets. If you want to install one, you can go get a rebate. And this is a very interesting graph here. And so this is starting in 1991, and this is looking at the water withdrawals within this 9-county area. And what we see over time is we see kind of a growth from 91, and then we get to the drought zone here in about 2007, and it goes pretty flat. And why is this pretty remarkable? Is that if we look at the population of Atlanta, it's been expanding. And so and this is one thing they're really proud of in Atlanta, and they'll say, look, we've been growing, we've added 1 million people or even more, and we're actually keeping withdrawals. If we go back to kind of the early 90s, we're almost right where we were then, even with adding 1 million people. And so going back to the survey, that it kind of, we can kind of ground truth this a little bit, even anecdotally, to say, oh, okay, yeah, of course people are changing how often that they're watering their yard because they're under these level 4 restrictions. And so that's going to be really fresh in their mind. And also these low flow toilets and faucets that, yeah, there's a lot of incentive programs out there for that. And so actually getting to the survey, there was for the Southeast region, there was a series of questions that had to do with water quantity. And just going to go through these here. Do you regard water quantity, having enough water, as a problem within your area? And so just the scale here, definitely not, all the way up to yes. And then what is the likelihood of your area having enough water resources to meet all of your needs 10 years from now? And it goes down from high to medium to likely. And so this is what we found in Georgia, that is a water quantity a concern? And if we go over here, these are really the yeses. And so you're talking 44% of people are saying we think water quantity is now a concern. And that actually turned out to be pretty high amongst the Southeast states. And this is looking in the future. Do we think that we can meet all of our needs in the future? And then so the low likelihood over here, that's a pretty high percentage there. 40% of these respondents were saying we think there's a low likelihood that we're going to be able to meet our needs in the future. And that's actually remarkably high. And then also getting into climate, that what is the likelihood of your area having a long drought into the future, and then going from increasing all the way down to staying the same? And this is when we could actually say these words here, global warming, but do you think the amount of rainfall within your area will change as a result of global warming? And then again, just the response is yes, it's going to increase, all the way down to yes, it's not, there's going to be less rainfall, and then also a no change, I don't know. So when we look at the future likelihood of drought, over here with the increasing 48%, that of course is the highest. And looking at this question here, global warming affecting local rainfall. One thing I will point out, very high percentage here, people saying they don't know. But if we compare, if we just kind of look at here, I would think it's going to be less versus we think it's going to be more, that we're definitely skewed on this end over here. And so we were kind of going through just kind of looking at these results, comparing them to Florida again. I mean, that's just me because I was from Florida. And so we were just discussing this, and we just couldn't help but think, to what extent does the fact that we just went through this historic drought in Georgia, how was that affecting the way people were thinking about this? And so again, water quantity, and also these things about climate change, and also drought variability. And so there is kind of a moment where you think is like the duh moment, that of course when there's drought that that of course people are going to be much more pessimistic about water resources. That's how we are as people. You know, when you're thirsty, you're going to be more pessimistic. But as we started going through the literature, there was actually very little that has actually been written about this. That the way people think in terms of their attitudes, it's all kind of anecdotal. And so what we found, and it's kind of thinking through this, that with the water quality survey, or with this national water survey, that when we're trying to say, okay, with outreach programming, to think about, okay, if we're using surveys to look at people's attitudes about water conservation and about water quantity, that if we're looking for changes, if you say you have a survey and then say 5 years later you have a program that comes out, and then you're looking for some difference to think, okay, have we been effective in terms of our program? Well, what if you have a drought that you haven't accounted for in there, and that really could be something that's skewing your results? And that was something that we did find in the literature, that has been recognized as a concern, but not one that's really been dealt with. So actually, my background, I'm a GIS nerd, okay, and I just love it's kind of looking at GIS data and maps and solving problems. And so someone was kind of pointing out the Drought Monitor. Has anyone seen the Drought Monitor? You might see it on the news. So it's this is from last week here, the Drought Monitor. This comes out every week, and so it gives these kind of pictures that you'll see on the news. But the nice thing is they actually have GIS maps that are actually behind this each week, and they have archives of these that go back to 2000. And so it's a weekly map from NOAA, USDA, and the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. And so they incorporate a whole bunch of different variables. It's a pretty complicated way they do this. So they look at soil moisture, they look at stream flows, they look at rainfall trends, precipitation trends, they look at reservoir and groundwater levels. They actually look at vegetation health, look at crop status reports. But also, very importantly, and this is where, in terms of an algorithm, because I was actually I'm like, what is the algorithm to get these? But in the end, they also run it by local climate experts. So they actually get folks together and say, okay, what are the conditions? And then so it ends up being a little bit subjective as well, but it ends up being pretty good. And so they do have this weekly archive that goes back to January of 2000, which ends up being a very rich source of data. Then after kind of stewing through it for a while and thinking how to do this, we said, okay, within the survey, one of the questions was zip code. And so what we kind of realized is, okay, we can use the zip code, which there's also, you can actually find what are the boundaries of zip codes. And so using a GIS method, we could go in and actually say, okay, what was the drought condition that people were experiencing at the time that these surveys went out? And so we ended up using two measures of drought. One was a long-term drought experience, which we kind of arbitrarily drew at 5 years and said, okay, 5 years before the survey went out, what was this average drought over 5 years? And also went with a short-term drought experience to say, okay, what is the drought condition right now? And I say right now, and that's a little bit wishy-washy because we didn't know exactly when the surveys came in, and so we went with about a 25-week window. And so we excluded the 25 weeks from the 5 years. So these are, in theory, somewhat independent. And so all those questions that I showed you there, that kind of full suite of water quality, or water quantity, then also climate variability questions. We had all these questions for the 9 states from the South. And we also had them from Hawaii. We decided to exclude Hawaii from this because there's a lot of issues in terms of the disjunct geography and the way that they measure the precipitation in Hawaii. And just rather than try to deal with all that for this analysis, we're just going to throw that out and just go ahead and include the states of the South. And so just using these 9 states, we end up with 3,163 respondents, which is a pretty good survey data set. And just, I'm not going to walk you through all this, but we've got the dates for all the states when the surveys went out. And so we went through this whole, there were some folks that have done GIS. Who's done GIS? Okay, so there's a few, and so we went through this whole GIS methodology, and the idea was we were just getting a mean drought score within the zip code, using the short term and using the long term drought. And so this is what it looked like. And the reason why, of course, these are areas that we didn't have respondent zip codes, we didn't. But so this is what the short-term drought looked like. And we can see kind of eastern Tennessee was really the worst, and Texas was really bad. Kind of interestingly, up here in Georgia, we were actually out of the drought when the survey went out. For the most part, Louisiana, some areas in Florida as well, had the short-term drought. But if we look at the long-term drought, if we look at this 5-year, then I guess they were in a pretty long-term drought here in Texas. But if we go up to Georgia, we can really see the remnants of that really severe drought that lasted for about 2.5 years. Also getting up here into Oklahoma, and also some areas there of western Florida were also in pretty bad drought for that 5-year period. And just to show there was some correlation between these, about 0.35, but that's enough to be, like in terms of doing logistic regressions, that yeah, these are correlated, but not so much to where it's going to be too much. So we went ahead and ran these in the model. So we did this ordinal logistic regression model, and so we ended up plugging a bunch of other variables in there. We had these from the survey, so we looked at this is one of the questions that we had in the survey, which ends up being pretty much a political kind of ideology, but it has to do with the environment all the way from over on the left here, which would be for total natural resource use, all the way over here, which we would call like the tree huggers, like the deep tree huggers for complete and total environmental protection. And a whole other suite of variables here: gender, age, education, the size of the city that you're from, how long you've lived in your local area, and also your rainfall as well. Your local rainfall, that's also important, that how much rain you get also we might think is going to affect how you're going to be thinking about water quantity. And so I'm just going to walk you through these ugly tables here, just to show you what we actually got with these logistic regression models. And who's actually done logistic regression in here? Maybe, yeah, okay. I guess the professor. And so let me just, okay. So all that's important really for this, I mean, if you want to talk the details, we can later, is just where we've got the stars here, so the really significant results. And just to kind of walk you through the long-term drought, when we're looking at current water quantity, that ended up being extremely significant. When we went to future water availability, again, the long-term drought was very significant. Let me also show, which is interesting up here, when we're looking at the short-term drought, the conditions being experienced right at the time, those were not significant for either of those.
What's your dependent variable again, to explain to them?
These are the attitudes of.
Attitude that environmental.
Yeah. So
Just that question, or an index of all of them?
Yeah, it's the. Let's see. Your dependent variable would actually be the question. Would actually be their attitudes and opinions to. I'll just walk through these here to these questions. Sorry, I should. To these questions here. So basically it's an ordinal scale here. So for the water quantity question, this is going to be your dependent variable. Okay. And so basically we coded these from an ordinal scale from 1 to 5. And for this one here it would have been a 1 to 3, that sort of thing. Does that make sense? And so if these are the same thing, these are going to be your dependent variables. All right. This is good because I haven't actually talked about this in a long time. I talked with Mike. This was good to revisit this. And so here's where it gets interesting. So then we're talking about looking at future drought, looking at prolonged drought in the future. That's when we start getting the effect here from the short term from short-term drought, from the actual conditions. And then basically in terms of the variables, basically when there's a higher amount of long-term drought, then people were much more pessimistic about their water quantity. And they were also much more pessimistic about what is going to be the future availability of water. And for this question here, in terms of thinking about future drought, that if there was a high drought condition right at the time they got the survey, then they were thinking there's a lot more probability of drought in the future, is what that's saying. Does that make sense? And it's the same thing here in terms of thinking about what is global warming going to do in terms of drought. That if there was a short-term drought happening, that like if there was a drought condition right then you're thinking what is going to happen with global warming? It's going to make it rain less in the future. Is what that's telling us. And this here was not something that I expected to see really. Like I made a lot of hay about this distinction actually, that in terms of water quantity and kind of like water, just thinking of water supply are these questions, and that ends up having this more long-term drought effect. But in terms of thinking about climate, just what is climate going to do, it's really what's happening right now is what's really driving, is what's very significant. And again, I'm just kind of pointing that out again here, that there was this very, like at least within these questions, it was pretty consistent. So I guess this is again just kind of reiterating this, that the short-term drought showed the strongest effects on the attitudes about climate variability and climate change. And so if there's more drought now, then you are much more likely to think that in the future there's going to be more drought. And in terms of long-term drought conditions, it showed either not as strong of an effect or actually no effect. And just want to show this, as I got into this literature and I was trying to make sense of it, that this is actually consistent with some other studies that have been looking at just the way people think about climate change. And one is that there's actually several studies that have looked at this just in terms of psychological experiments, that the higher temperature it is outside, that there's actually a very significant effect that has actually been measured that, hey, it's hot today, so there must be global warming. And that it ends up being a pretty significant effect there. And then the other, like almost the opposite way, that there have been some studies that have said, okay, that people that actually, like if you ask them about global warming, and if you think that, yeah, like I think there's a such thing as global warming, that you actually think it's hotter outside too than it may be, which is also pretty interesting. This is my favorite, that there was this French experiment. I guess the French are just known for just doing weird psychological experiments, but they would ask people about what are your effects with or what do you think about global warming, and the only variable they would change would be the foliage inside the room. And so if you would have a tree that was, like if your plant that was in the room was green and was all pretty, then people, were not as likely to think that there was global warming. But if you put a dead tree, like a dead sickly tree, then people were much more likely to believe that global warming was real, which I just found that humorous and also interesting and strange. But and so a long-term drought again showed the strongest effects on attitudes about water quantity and also about future supply. And what was interesting about this is in terms of short-term drought, it didn't have there's no effect that we could really see, no real significant effect on those attitudes. And I went through the literature. I should actually go through it again to see if anyone else has found this since we wrote this up. But this was the first one that I've seen that's ever seen any kind of relationship between long-term climate additions and the way that folks are thinking about their local water resources. Even though it makes good sense, it's just really the first that I've really seen it documented. And what might explain this? I mean, in terms of a long-term effect, like if you believe the psychologists, they think, well, really that at least in terms of climate change, that folks are really just focused on the short term, that it's very abstract, but there could be explanations. So something like water restrictions, that if you're having to restrict your behavior, the government is telling you what to do, it may be kind of imprints. But even, yeah, it could be more likely that if you're having to pay higher water bills and that stays on longer than the drought, then that might also affect the way that you think. And again, and also highly visible water planning efforts. Even in Georgia now, I mean, as it has started raining in Georgia again, this year was probably the wettest it's been for, I don't know, like 15, 20 years in the summertime. And so now in terms of water planning, it's just we want to build more reservoirs. They say that we have conserved everything that we can conserve, and so we really need to go out and build more water supply. But with those water planning efforts, then that, like maybe that, I don't know. I mean, that might be another thing that could be driving people's attitudes. And so again, just to reiterate that these might be prompted by past droughts, and they might actually fix attitudes about local water supply. This is all kind of speculative discussion, but just some ideas. And so, to get to, what does all this mean? And the first conclusion really was what kind of drove the first question, and I guess the first concern is that, that if we're using surveys to try to gauge our programs and how effective that the educational programs are, that we've actually shown in terms of the intuition of, well, maybe drought could be important in the way people are thinking about things, that, us come to find out that's true, that we should be concerned about that. If we don't, then we end up, we could have very misleading conclusions, that if you have a drought and then people are going to, and you say, oh, well, look at my public, they are really concerned about water now, and but it could just be a drought. And so you may think that your program is a lot more effective than it is. Or you may have a very effective program and it's raining and it's just, and so it's not that your folks aren't doing a good job, it's that there's just this climate variability. And so the good news is that what this confirms for me is when they were doing the survey, there was no idea of kind of doing this. This was all post facto. We're going to go ahead and try and shape this to, to actually tease us out of there using Drought Monitor. And it seems to provide a pretty reliable and rigorous way of doing this. I mean, the fact that we showed such highly significant results, that we've also thought that, well, if you're doing this right up front, that it's even when you're coding your survey to go to the Drought Monitor, and rather than having to do this 25-week thing, that, okay, this is when the survey came in, they were taking it last week, this is what their current condition when they were taking the survey was, and that would be really good information to have. And it's free as well. That's the other nice thing. Very free, very easy to use. And again, this is just to say that when we're doing these surveys, that if we think about this up front, that we could really design it to be much more efficient. I'll say the GIS that we did for this, it was a lot of crunching. It was a lot of to try and just kind of post do that, and it makes it more complicated than if you're doing it up front. And so that's exactly what I was saying there before, that when you get the survey come in, you can just go ahead and, what is your drought condition? And that would make things way easier than what we did. And so I just wanted to acknowledge all the folks here. So Mike Smolin, who really was the fearless leader over the past 3 years. We've been working on this survey. And I don't know, how many publications have come out of that survey, Mike? So we're really mining this data set. It's really a rich data set. And some folks here, you may actually know some folks here from University of Florida. Damian Adams, I guess he was at Oklahoma State for a number of years, and Diana from Texas A&M, Tatiana from University of Florida, John Calabria, and Nikki Soshaka, I can never pronounce her name, and Bob Mahler from University of Idaho. He's the one who's been, this whole survey project has been his baby for the past, 10 years, 15 years. And just been great. I mean, Bob's a busy guy, but he's gone out of his way to help us and just provide data. And it's just, again, just this rich source of data. And I've only tackled here only 4 questions, and there's just so much data to go through that you could spend a whole career probably going through it. Yeah, and also had some support from the folks at University of Nebraska-Lincoln. They're also very helpful as well. If you want to use the Drought Monitor, you call those guys up and they will help guide you through all that. And so with that, if you guys have any questions and want to talk about things, I might have blown through this, but yeah. Yeah, that's all I would do. I would actually keep the survey questions the same. I mean, and that's actually really important in terms of your survey methods to keep. You really want to keep your questions consistent, but just even the idea that, like, when you get in your results, that to actually just even record what was the drought condition at the time. Like, we had thought about. Very briefly, I thought about trying to do that, but then going back in and trying to recode 3,000 or so surveys, and we weren't even sure what dates they came in, and so that was an impossible task. But it's just one thing you do when you actually have the money to sit there and code it. That to have just one more question: what is the drought condition within this zip code at that time? That's something you can do very quickly, and then just add that in there, and that would be extremely valuable.
Talk much about the demographics of your actual return
Yeah.
Sample set.
Yep.
Is it fully representative of the population of the state of Georgia?
Well, the survey was very consistently more male, more highly educated, and those are really the two that stick out, the more male and more highly educated. And that was consistent through all the surveys just about. They all ended up being between 62 and 65% male. And we have grappled with that. And if you talk with Bob, I mean, he's like, well, we have enough numbers, and and then it is actually, in terms of the methods, that you have enough to kind of wash all that out, but no, it's not. It is not representative of what the actual population is of Georgia, or anywhere. And so that's we had talked about trying to weight these things in terms of census data and what are the actual demographics. And this was really my first venture into working with survey data like this. I'm actually trained as an ecologist, so it was a strange beast. And I'd say every survey person I talked with had kind of a different opinion about what to do about it. And then in the end, they're like, for your question, I talked with some stats guys, they're like, with your question, just let's go ahead and pretend that doesn't matter. but that is a question that's plagued this thing the entire time. I don't think we ever resolved. I was actually reading through Bob's through his write-up, and I think the way that he gets around it is just that in terms of the methods and numbers, that each of the subpopulations and each of like the demographic groups, you have enough of each of those to capture them. But yeah, I'm not, Mike.
It was interesting because they made a very strong attempt to get a balance on male and female. They did not send to any names that were just an initial, for example. They asked for the person who, I don't remember the question, but they specifically directed to the person who would answer to be an adult and not necessarily male or female, and yet they got more males responding than they did females. It was very strange.
I don't necessarily find that strange. We did one in Stillwater where it went in the utility bill, and anybody who got the utility bill could respond. And unfortunately, who does the male is usually still very gendered and male.
Mm-hmm.
And so our utility bill response, to give you here you have a Dillman method where you sent it in mail, which is very expensive. We did this in Oklahoma and we got a 20% response rate. And similar one we did in Minnesota got 70% response rate. And it costs us $12,000 to get 500 surveys back out of 2,000. It was 400 usable or something out of 2,000, whatever makes that 20%. And so, for what you're doing, saying across your bias sample, you do have the same bias sample across the same states.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So,
Yep.
so it answers your question, but only for older men. So the one we did with Stillwater, we got 1.5% of the people in Stillwater who did our internet survey of 20,000 households. And they were 52-year-old males.
Mm-hmm.
And Stillwater is not made up of only 52-year-old males, as you can see, but they're the homeowners who pay the bills.
Yeah.
Younger people live in apartments. Their water bill may be part of their rent. They may not care to respond to these things. So you're always going to get that bias of the more established homeowner,
Mm-hmm.
who tends to be an older person, who doesn't have 3 kids running around and like, yeah, you want me to do a survey. So there are reasons for that you can logically think of.
Yep. And yeah, so trying to get through that bias, I actually had a survey guy that was like 2 doors down from me, and then he just said, yeah, there's the exact same thing you're saying, that he's like, we try and try, but it's just you end up just getting back what you can, and then you just note what your biases are, and you don't try to overextend it beyond, that what this is saying. And one way that I think Mark Greasy here, as we were kind of talking through, he's like, in a way, this is important, at least for Georgia, that these kind of educated white men, that they are the elite of the state, and they're the ones that are making all these decisions. And so in some way, it's good to know what they're thinking. I mean, even though it's not a public opinion survey. You want to have that balanced survey, but that's probably making lemonades out of lemon. Yeah.
Yeah, so just talking about the different kinds of drought, did you all consider that? So, this is meteorological drought, lack of precipitation, that's one. What about, agricultural drought? I know in that same period, Lance talked a lot about that, but severe drought experience and how it affected farming practices, how their attitudes.
With the Drought Monitor, they do include looking at crop conditions but it's there's a lot of argument about the way they do that too. But they claim that they do include that within there, and then in terms of their index, it's a 1 to 4 index basically for drought, and so from 1 that you're in drought all the way to 4, which is the exceptional, most extreme drought. And so that's like in some ways that's a pretty simplistic measure. I mean, just 1, 2, 3, 4. But the idea that they say is they are that if you have an agricultural drought and you also have a low rainfall, that's when you're going to get that 4, is when it's so severe that it's really affecting everything across the board. So I guess the short answer is that they are saying they're including it, but the long answer is probably not in the most holistic way that you could.
So the takeaway from this is Oklahoma's in the process of taking their state water plan to legislative decision-making. The water plan's done, the legislators are supposed to act on it. So we've got 5 years before everyone forgets about it. Or it does it all over again and we don't have to worry about it, but.
It's more appropriate to measure it in terms of inches of rain before everybody forgets about it. Because once it starts raining, everybody goes, oh, we're out of the drought. That's exactly what we're seeing in Georgia right now. I mean, is that as last year we had a really severe drought as well. And I was kind of joking with Mike that last year that basically what their solution was for drought in Georgia last year was just not declare it. And I'm being absolutely serious that the solution was, even though in terms of for Southwest Georgia, in terms of agricultural lands down there, it was the worst drought that had been seen in a long time, even worse than the one from 2007. But just we're not going to declare it. And this year it's been raining a lot, and now the idea is, and I was joking with Mike again that I even said this earlier, that now they're saying conservation, like I've been at several meetings, they said conservation, we're done with conservation, that we have conserved all we can conserve. Now we're going to start building reservoirs, and we're going to try to capture all this rain when it does rain and save it for the times that we don't. And that's an expensive proposition, but that is the mindset. And then when you see, I mean, right now you go through Georgia, and you got the rivers up and everything's green, and then so again everyone's thinking, well, it must be like this forever. Now we made it through that bad period, and so you have to strike when it's happening. You have to get legislation in there to actually to get it to where it's law. Absolutely. Mike.
As Jason mentioned, this was done in Oklahoma. In Oklahoma, we hit about 50%, plus or minus 1 on the returns. And the summary is not as thorough as the Georgia summary, but there is a presentation on it that has some of the same charts for Oklahoma. So if anyone's interested, I can probably help you find that.
You can send it to me, I'll show it to them in class. When we cover water, please.
And then you're due for your 5-year, aren't you, here in Oklahoma? Wasn't yours in 2007, 2008?
That's an interesting point. If someone were to come up with the money, I believe the University of Idaho would extend the same service that they did before and help Oklahoma do that again. Texas is in the process of doing theirs again. Idaho actually has done it twice since 2001. So they've established a trend by keeping some of the same questions.
Yep.
And we would be just past the 5-year point for ours. So I'd love to see that done again.
Yeah, we've already been talking in Georgia, even though I guess we're about 3.5 years since ours went out, but we want to do it again and see. Yeah, because it's just again a wonderful data set. I mean, it's just amazing. When we finally got the full national data set, it really is just absolutely remarkable for 41 states over about a 12-year period, and actually seeing those states up in the Northwest. I think it's all the states in the Northwest they've done it twice, and so yeah, that's right. And so it's
extremely valuable, and we would just hate to see it go away.
I agree with Mike that it would be a very interesting additional survey for Oklahoma based on your geographic location, because unlike most of the other southern states,
Mm-hmm.
the average annual rainfall varies so greatly
Yep.
across this state compared to Georgia, Florida,
Yep.
and many of the others, that perceptions of northwest corner down to the southeast corner could be quite drastically different,
Yep.
because it just doesn't rain the same.
It's funny that you mentioned that, because we have $25 million to do that
Really?
under the EPSCoR grant. And the OU people in political science are creating a panel of people who will answer questions over the next 5 years in an actual geographically referenced location with oversampling for a different group of physical measurements that we'll be doing as a team. They will be asking them quarterly a set of standard questions and then some that change seasonally to look at their resilience to changes in climate and their perceptions of climate in general, but water and heat will be the two main foci if I'm more involved. So we're going to be looking at that in the project. It started this July. They hope to have the panel started in February. But it will be very intensive because they're going to hand someone a computer who doesn't have a computer, get them an internet connection, and then they have to follow these people throughout time. And if you have a truly representative sample, who do you think is going to be harder to follow throughout time? People who move a lot, people who have less money, people who are more transient, and that's why you get 60-year-old white males. Sherry, if you put it right there. But anyway, we are doing that. We're also working on a project with Oklahoma City looking at people's water perceptions over the next 3 years and working at them with outdoor watering and seeing if our training on outdoor watering has an effect after 3 years. So it's quite an exciting time for me and for the team of people working here in Ag Hall on these projects. We do have money for undergraduates to work with us. If you like Excel and GIS, you're particularly welcome.
Yeah, there's one person in GIS. Yeah, I saw one hand in GIS. Yeah, I used to all learn GIS. If you're going to go into environmental sciences, I mean, just do the hard sell for GIS. So, like, it was something I just did as a side thing, and then now I've made a career out of it. So just learn it. It's not as hard as you think.
So I think that maybe the students are getting a little antsy to wrap it up. Are there any more questions? We will have a reception immediately following this in 410 Ag Hall, which is the conference room around the corner, with cookies and punch. Everyone is invited to continue this discussion, ask other discussions. Assume the data sets are also publicly available for students looking for projects for Dr. Jones' class. And I want to say thank you for coming and.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. Yeah, it was great. Thanks, guys.